Yes,
Okay, you can hear me, I assume. So,
you're
okay,
good.
well, they've asked me to talk to you about today is alfalfa insects and their management. And so, what we'll do is go through some of the major insects, help you identify some of the minor ones, and then also the beneficials. But again, maybe give you a feel for all the insects that you might find out in an alfalfa field. So, the major insects. Right at the top of the list is alfalfa weevil. Anybody that raises alfalfa, they've probably seen this problem out in the field. You can see down here on the bottom the adult, and then she lays the eggs inside the stem over here on the right. But it's the larvae that really do all the damage to the alfalfa. They chew the leaves. One way you can identify this larva from other caterpillars would be this black shiny head here, very indicative of the alfalfa weevil. They can be quite devastating. They go through several instars here. You can see one that's a little bit smaller here, and then as they feed, they get larger, but they can really devastate a lot of the foliage of alfalfa and be quite a factor in your alfalfa production. So, weevil control, determining what the action level is. A lot of times it just depends on how tall your alfalfa is, the plant height. Um, you know, 2 to 6 inches before that first cut, you only need one larva per terminal to maybe decide to do something about that insect that's out there. As the alfalfa gets a little bit bigger, a little bit more tolerance there as far as how many, but uh, as you get close to cutting, if you're within 1 or 2 weeks of cutting, you have to really make a decision whether it's advisable to just cut early and use that to harvest as a means of controlling some of the insects versus applying an insecticide. But the other thing that you do have to be aware of, if you do have a lot of alfalfa weevils out there and you harvest that, they still might be in that windrow, and so you may need a stubble treatment depending on if the weather is favorable, cloudy days, mild temperatures that allow good weevil survival in that stubble under the windrow. So even though you've cut that alfalfa, make sure that those weevils aren't really chewing up the alfalfa under those windrows. So something to be aware of. Another insect that we sometimes see is the potato leafhopper. You can see in the upper left here, that's the adult and the larva there. But the type of damage that we see on the alfalfa is this yellowing on the tips of the leaves, very indicative of the potato leafhopper feeding. But you can see down in here on the bottom left, it really can be quite devastating to the alfalfa stand and have an impact on how much forage you're going to produce off that field. Now, again, also the potato leaf hopper, the thresholds there, it somewhat depends on uh, how tall that alfalfa is. And I think the interesting fact here is like if we look down here, if the alfalfa stem is 10 inches tall, if we go over and make 10 sweeps with a sweep net in that field, and we have 10 leaf hoppers per 10 sweeps, the same height as the alfalfa, that's when we decide the threshold is time to spray. So if the number of leaf hoppers in 10 sweeps is the same as the height of the plant, that's a good indicator it's time to do something with that insect out in the field. Now, there are alfalfa varieties out there that have been released that have some resistance to the potato leafhopper. That doesn't always mean that you don't have to spray, even though you've got a resistant variety out there, but it does increase the threshold quite a bit. If you have a non potato leafhopper resistant variety and you do have a leafhopper count of 10 sweeps exceeds the average height in inches, you probably need to spray. But if you have a potato leafhopper resistant variety, you can tolerate 3 times as much of the number of leafhoppers out in the field. So again, that leafhopper resistant variety gives you a little bit better tolerance. But at the end of the day, if the leafhoppers population is just too great, you still may even have to spray a potato leafhopper resistant variety. So go out there and monitor your field and make sure you know what's happening out there as far as leafhopper numbers. The next thing on my list that's pretty important to the hay producer is aphids. 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have as many types of aphids as we do now. in the early years, we had the pea aphid, and then in the 1950s, we started seeing the spotted aphid. And then in the 70s, we started seeing the blue aphid. And then in the last 15 to 20 years, we've been seeing the cowpea aphid. So a lot of the old alfalfa varieties didn't have resistance to these new aphids that are out there. So be aware that if you are seeing some aphids out in the field, there are some alfalfa varieties that do have some genetic resistance, and a lot of your old varieties just don't have resistance to those. Now, it's really important to know which aphid you have out in that alfalfa field. We can tolerate a lot of pea aphids, but these other aphids, the blue aphid, the spotted aphid, and the cowpea aphid, they all inject a toxin. But as far as of these 4 aphids, which one is the worst? I think the blue alfalfa aphid is probably the worst, hardest to control. Next in line would be the spotted aphid, and then the cowpea aphid, and then, like I said, the pea aphid, less of a concern because it doesn't inject a toxin where the other 3 do. So, again, really important to know what aphid you have out in the field because it will make a difference on how much damage they're inflicting on your hay production. So let's take a look at some of the 2 aphids that are sometimes confused, the blue alfalfa aphid and the pea aphid. They look somewhat similar, but if you get out a hand lens and take a closer look, there is a difference between the 2 aphids that you can identify. But again, it's real important to know if you have the blue aphid because it injects a toxin, and if you have the pea aphid, it does not inject a toxin when it's feeding on the alfalfa plant. So the thing that we look for in distinguishing between the 2 is the antenna. If you look down here on the bottom left, you can see this is the pea aphid. But if you look at the antenna, at some of the joints, you'll see a dark band. That's really indicative of the pea aphid. Where versus on the blue aphid, that antenna is more uniform brown. And so again, get out your hand lens. If you're take your sweep net out in the field and you've got some aphids out there, take a look at those antennae. If you've got the banded antenna, that's an indicator that you've got the pea aphid. But if you've got more of a uniform antenna on that aphid, that's a good chance you've got the blue aphid. So again, knowing which aphid you have can make a big difference on what you're going to do. Are you going to have to spray, or how much damage each aphid is going to do out there in the field? Here's another close-up of those antennae. Here on the left, again, you can see that dark band on the pea aphid at the joint there. Again, a very good indicator. You can look at that with a hand lens and really distinguish that. Here on the right, you can see that more uniform brown on that antenna indicated of the blue alfalfa aphid. So again, real important to know which one you have. Close shot, pea aphids usually cause the greatest damage in the spring or early summer, and again in the fall. But again, the pea aphid is the least harmful of all the aphids. Of all the 4 aphids that we have that damage alfalfa, it's the only one that doesn't inject a toxin when it's feeding on alfalfa. Spotted aphid, we first started seeing the spotted aphid in the 1950s. Wasn't even native to North America. It first showed up in New Mexico and outside an Air Force base. We figured that it came in on a plane out of the Middle East because all the alfalfa fields outside the fence of the airport, the Air Force location, started having problems with spotted aphid. And it really, in a short amount of time, made a lot of the alfalfa varieties we had at that time obsolete because they just didn't have any genetic resistance to the spotted aphid. So it can be quite devastating. It does like warmer temperatures. So you'll see the spotted aphid more later in the summer. It likes also the lower part of the alfalfa plant. And so you have to be careful when you're out there sweeping. It's going to be closer to the ground. So make sure you're looking down. If you're seeing a lot of honeydew lower on the plant, check and see what aphids that are out there. And if they have spots on the back, it's spotted alfalfa aphid, and they can inflict some damage on that alfalfa. Sometimes, but not always, we'll see the feeding of the spotted aphid will cause the veins of the leaves to turn yellow. Doesn't always happen, but again, it is an indicator of the spotted aphid. This upper right photograph really gives you a size perspective. The spotted aphid, it's the smallest of the four aphids that we have. You can see here, I've highlighted the spotted aphid, and then right next to it, we have the pea aphid. So spotted aphid is smaller, but again, it injects that toxin, and so it can damage that plant. And on alfalfa seedlings, if you get it on alfalfa seedlings, it doesn't take very many of the spotted aphids to kill that seedling. So again, knowing what aphid you have will make a difference on your response. Here in the last 15 to 20 years, we started seeing the cowpea aphid. In the early years, we never saw this as an issue, but now we are seeing it in some parts of the country being a problem. I've even seen alfalfa fields in New Mexico that have been taken out by the cowpea aphid. A lot of times it likes the cooler temperatures in the spring, and sometimes a farmer, he just drives by a field and he thinks it's just sort of slow of breaking dormancy, but once he got out of his pickup and went out there and looked, he had the cowpea aphid, and they were inflicting a lot of damage on that stand out there. They also inject a toxin, not as much as maybe the blue or the spotted, but they can have an effect on that alfalfa. Sometimes when you're out there sweeping the fields and you find aphids with a lot of aphids with wings, that either means they're just arriving. Aphids can be mobile. They don't always have wings, but if the population density gets real high, they'll start developing wings and they'll move. So either they're arriving or leaving if you're seeing a lot of aphids with wings. Now, like I was mentioning, we've got four aphids. Only one doesn't inject a toxin, and so that really makes a difference as far as your threshold of when you're going to have to spray or what you're going to do. You can see up here, aphids per stem, we could tolerate 40 and a plant that's 10 inches tall. But if you look at the spotted aphid, we can only tolerate half as many. So again, because of that toxin, that can make a difference on the thresholds of each one of these aphids that are out in the field. So again, be aware which aphid you have, and that will make a difference as far as whether you're going to have to spray at a certain level or not. Now, next on our list will be caterpillars and like beet armyworms and the worms, but really there hasn't been much success from the alfalfa breeders in developing resistance to these worms, but I wanted to point them out and so that you know what you might have out in the field, what you're looking for. The alfalfa caterpillar, you're always familiar with these little yellow butterflies out in the field. Sometimes they're pale yellow, but again, they can inflict some damage on the alfalfa. Alfalfa caterpillar, the thresholds, if you have one or two more worms per 5 sweeps on alfalfa plants that are less than 15 inches tall, then you might consider spraying. Again, we want to really protect our beneficials out there, and so if you can use bacillus versus spraying an insecticide, that might be an advantage out there. And also the treatment is justified if you have 25 to 30 worms in 100 sweeps. But again, sort of like with some of the other insects, if you have a heavy infestation and it's almost close to cutting time, maybe you want to consider cutting the crop instead of spraying it at that late date just before you're going to harvest that field. A lot of times, cutting the field can really have make that insect population crash. So again, how close you are to the harvest date can make a difference on your management decision. Western yellow striped armyworms. We have fall armyworms. A lot of different types of armyworms out there. Beet armyworm, again, a lot of these, there's not any genetic resistance to them as far as alfalfa varieties. But again, you need to be aware of what you have out there. Some are a little bit more devastating than others. Kansas State University has a really good publication that helps you identify these. Here you can see on the beet armyworm that black spot just behind the head here, an indicator of the beet armyworm. But again, knowing which insect you have can make a difference on your management decision. Beet armyworm, again, just depends on how many you have out in the field. You take 5 sweeps. If you have one worm per 5 sweeps on plants less than 15 inches tall, maybe you need to consider controlling that armyworm. Cutworms can be a problem every so often. A lot of times they come out at night and feed. You may not always see them during the middle of the day. Insecticide baits work sometimes better on these cutworms, and because a lot of times they're down into the soil and you just can't get good coverage with a contact spray. But these insecticide baits generally work pretty good on these cutworms. Again, action level, treat when there is a average of 2 to 3 or more larvae per square yard. The army cutworm, a little bit more critical on the levels of number of worms out there. But again, knowing which one you have can make a difference on how you manage that. Another insect that, again, there's not any genetic resistance as far as alfalfa varieties, but we have been seeing out here in the western U.S. A fair amount of damage from this other insect it's called the clover root cucurlio. Even the name says clover, but it is a major pest on alfalfa. It really, the adult looks very similar to the adult alfalfa weevil. They both lay eggs in the alfalfa stems, but what happens is that they, on that clover root cucurlio, the larvae burrow down into the soil and start attacking the roots, where the alfalfa weevil, the larva is attacking all the leaves above ground. So the females look the same, but again, the larvae have different feeding habits. And so here on the far left, you can see an alfalfa taproot. Look at all this scarring and feeding on that bark of that root. They can be quite devastating as far as how much damage they're inflicting on that alfalfa root. Really affects the ability of that root to bring up nutrients and perform that alfalfa production out there in that field. The other thing that happens with all that feeding on that alfalfa root, you're really opening up that root to other secondary infections of any pathogens that might be in the soil. So you've got this open wound, and if there's a pathogen in the soil, it can get established in that root. And so you start getting a lot of crown rots and root diseases that are secondary infections that come from all this feeding by this clover root cucurlio. Another close-up of that, you can just see all that feeding on those roots by that larva. The problem is, people ask, well, can we spray and kill the adult before she lays her eggs? And it's been really difficult to predict when to spray, and so it really hasn't been successful. Using an insecticide trying to control the female before she lays the eggs. We really don't have any good insecticide control for this larva feeding feeding on the roots, especially because the larvae are below ground. Alfalfa weevil, they're feeding above ground and we can spray them, but when that insect is feeding below ground, it's really difficult to do anything with that as far as an insecticide. So even though we're getting a lot of damage out there, there are a few management things that we can help that alfalfa survive that damage that's being inflicted on it. Mainly it comes down to is reducing any stress on the plants. That insect is chewing up the roots, that plant is under stress, so we want to maintain good soil fertility. We don't have the best of root systems because that insect is damaging the root hairs and the side roots. So maintain good soil fertility. We don't want to put that added stress on that plant. Also reduce water stress. We've seen that in fields that have a lot of clover root cucurlio damage, that when we put them under some water stress, they really can suffer in those situations. And we've actually seen fields that just didn't make it when they were under severe water stress, drought conditions, or if a well went down and they had severe clover root cucurlio damage, they may not recover. So again, anything that we can do to reduce the stress on the plants. If we go out there and we dig up some plants and we see a lot of damage, we can reduce the water stress and also maybe even relax the cutting regime. Don't be as aggressive on your cutting regime. Again, at the end of the day, we're just trying to reduce the amount of stress and hoping that they will recover from that damage. Avoid soil compaction. Again, just reduce the amount of stress. And we have seen in some cases that some of these stands have recovered from the damage that was inflicted. Here's a table that shows different insects are a problem at different times of the year. The alfalfa weevil, we usually see most of its damage on mainly on that first cut. Uh, uh, they migrate out of the field during the middle of summer, but then the adults will lay their eggs in the fall. The pea aphid, the blue aphid, they like a little bit more of the cool temperatures, so we'll see them in the spring also. Like I mentioned earlier, the spotted aphid, it really likes the middle of the summer. Hot, dry weather is really favorable for the spotted aphid. In the fall, the pea aphid can come back. We may also see some cowpea aphids in the fall and also cowpea aphids in the spring too. So leafhopper, we generally see most of the damage after the first cut. They're just getting established on the first cut, and then they really build up on that second cut. Alfalfa caterpillar, beet and fall armyworms, middle of the summer. Grasshoppers and blister beetles. Grasshoppers we'll see during the middle of summer. And the thing to watch out for the grasshoppers, they can come in from the rangeland that's bordering on your alfalfa. And so, in the past, when I was an alfalfa scout looking for insects in fields, we always, on years that grasshoppers were a problem, we sure enough had to watch the edge of the fields that bordered on rangeland. There are also some minor insects out there that when farmers go out and look at their fields, they see this damage, and so I wanted to point that out. One of the most common ones that we see is thrips. If insect is pretty small, almost like about the size of a comma, but they feed on the bottom side of the alfalfa leaf. They have what they call rasping, sucking mouth parts. They'll scrape the bottom side of that leaf, and as that leaf is trying to grow, you get a lot of scarring on the bottom side of the leaf, and you start seeing this crinkled appearance from all that scar tissue from the wounds and the feeding of the thrips. And you can see in some cases, you may see a lot of crinkling out in the field, but at the end of the day, they're not a major issue. They may affect a little bit of the quality out there, but very seldom have we had to spray for thrips out in the field. But every once in a while, but for the most part, you see the damage, but it's not a major factor in your production. Grasshoppers, like I said, in years that where the rains are right, if alfalfa is bordering on some range grasses, you really need to watch out for the grasshoppers, because if there is a good hatch that year, that's where they'll be migrating from. They're coming out of the rangeland grasses into the alfalfa, and they can really damage the edges of alfalfa fields if you're not watching for them. So again, watch out for the grasshoppers on the edges of your fields. Thresholds, 8 per square yard for rangeland, and if you've got 10 per square yard in alfalfa, you might need to look at controlling the grasshoppers. Spider mites is not an insect, but I threw it in here because we occasionally have issues with spider mites. We do have control measures for those, but again, just be aware of what's out there and monitor your fields. Spider mites tend to be worse in dry periods or when the alfalfa is under water stress situations. Again, the action level is early cutting may be more economical than spraying for them. So again, depending on where you are and as far as the growth in that alfalfa cut, if you're getting close to cutting, that may control more of the spider mites than then trying to spray for them. Another insect I sometimes get questions on is the alfalfa leaf miner. Again, it's not really something that we worry about, but you will occasionally see that out in the field. The insect lays the egg right in between the top layers of the leaf, and it actually starts out small, and then as it's feeding, it gets bigger. You can see the tunneling here get bigger and bigger. the insect is really in between the leaf epidermis, I guess. Uh, but it's you can't really scrape him off here, but you will occasionally see this out in the field, and farmers will ask, "What is that damage, and do I have to worry about it?" And really, it's nothing that we're too concerned about. Three-cornered hoppers, sometimes we call them buffalo hoppers. They can girdle an alfalfa stem. Here's the young hopper. Looks sort of different, but you can see that with this big head up at the front, it looks sort of like a buffalo. But again, we occasionally have issues with those, and mainly they'll girdle some of the stems, and you'll see some stems that turn a straw color. Other insects, if you're out there with a sweep net, I threw this one in because you'll most likely see some of these in your sweep net. It's Lygus. You can sort of identify them with this bright triangle on the back. They may be some that are slightly green colors, some a little bit more reddish colors, but again, a lot of different colors, but that triangle on the back. But really, they're not a problem as far as forage production, but they are our #1 pest on alfalfa seed production. And they can feed on the buds, the flowers, the seed pods. They can strip the flowers off here. Another interesting thing is that in a sweep net, these young nymphs, they look about the size of a pea aphid or a blue aphid, but they're really fast in a net. So they don't have the wings yet. And so, again, be aware that you may pick those up in the sweep net, but they're not an issue on alfalfa hay production. Blister beetles, every so often we have reports of blister beetles. Something to be concerned about, not because they damage the alfalfa, but these blister beetles do have a toxin in their shell. And so our main concern with blister beetles is the poison risk to livestock. If we're putting up hay and we crush some of those in that haying process and they end up in that hay, and that's fed to livestock, especially horses, can be quite a problem with these blister beetles. Here you can see some hay that here is several different colors and of the blister beetle. Here we have a black one on this left. You can see all those got crushed and ended up in that hay. Here on the right we have one of the striped blister beetles. Again, we just have to be aware if we have had problems with blister beetles, be aware that monitor your fields and see if you're seeing any blister beetles out in the field. A lot of times they'll occur in swarms. They like, especially on flowering alfalfa, they like to feed on the flowers and the pollen, and so they're attracted to that. If you've got an alfalfa field that's a little bit farther along and is flowering, you might attract some of these blister beetles. You know, there's always, you always hear these anecdotal things about it only took one blister beetle to kill my horse. Well, that's not quite true. There is a different level of toxicity depending on which blister beetle you have. The striped beetle seems to be carry a little bit more toxin. But again, and also the male blister beetles have a higher concentration of toxin in that shell. It really, on a 1,000-pound horse, probably 81 to 128 beetles. That if that horse ingests that many in that hay, can kill that horse. Here's some other numbers. Again, depending on the beetle that you blister beetle you have, the black takes a lot more of those, 550 for a 275-pound horse. But if you look down here, the striped, it only takes 40 of those for that same size horse. So depending on the size of the horse and also the type of blister beetle can make a difference on how toxic that is, that if it gets in the hay. So these blister beetles do swarm out in the field. So a lot of times if you're cutting your alfalfa, you might see them in these swarms. So just avoid them, and a lot of times they'll just fly away eventually. So other things, if you've had a problem in the past, the crimpers, that's a problem, is that when you swath out there in the field and they go through the crimper, you kill those blister beetles, and a dead beetle is deadlier than a live beetle. A live beetle might fly away, but that dead beetle that ends up in that hay can be quite a problem. You know, controlling, you know, there's some debate on whether to spray for them. A lot of times these swarms will just fly away, but just be aware when you're out there harvesting, if you're seeing them, avoid that and try not to run them through the swather and crimp them. So I do want to mention beneficial insects. They're really our friends out there in the field, and not sometimes people don't always recognize these beneficials. We've got a lot of good ones out there in alfalfa fields. You just need to be aware and uh, and sort of temper what you're doing as far as spraying, because every time we spray, we might kill some of our beneficials. Um, Lady beetle, bright orange eggs. Not everybody recognized the larvae, but they look like little alligators. But the larvae of the lady beetle actually probably feed more on the aphids than actually the adult does. So again, these larvae can be quite beneficial in helping control that population. Another real good beneficial is the lacewing. We have the green lacewing. It's a little bit bigger than the brown, but both these lacewings can be quite beneficial. You can see here the eggs are sort of on like a hair, egg on the end of a hair on a plant stem or on a leaf. They're also, their larva looks somewhat like the lady beetle larva, a little bit different color, but again, they can be quite beneficial in controlling insects out there. Minute pirate bug, you can see it here is getting some of feeding. It's a smaller of the beneficials, but it can feed on the aphids and also spider mites and thrips. You can see up here on the left. Here's an immature minute pirate bug feeding on an aphid. So again, good insect. Big eye bug, it sort of lives up to its name, has big eyes, but again, it can be a good beneficial force out in the field. There's a whole array of other beneficials, the assassin bug, the damsel or nabbids. Again, all these can be beneficial in helping control the harmful insects out in the field. We also have some parasitic wasps. This is quite interesting. This wasp will lay its egg inside a living aphid. And sort of like the movie Aliens, that egg will hatch inside that living aphid. And just before that aphid starts to die, it'll crawl up on top of a leaf, and then eventually, like in that movie Aliens, the parasitic wasp will hatch out and they exit from the aphid. But again, can be beneficial, and you can see here on the upper right that parasitic wasp injecting an egg into an aphid. Just be aware of the beneficials. When pest populations are just at the threshold, sometimes it's maybe more favorable to, if you still have a good beneficial count, maybe wait off a little bit before you spray and see if those beneficials can take care of the problem. If you're right at that threshold and you have a good number of beneficials out there, consider delaying for a little while, because once you spray, you're going to kill a lot of beneficials, and you may have to spray more throughout the rest of the summer. So thresholds and insecticides, hopefully your sweep nets don't look like this one, but there are some good publications out there. Check those guides. Kansas State University has a really good alfalfa insect management guide. You can pull that up on the web and download that. They also have a good guide on identifying the different caterpillars out in the field. You can pull that up on the web. Blister beetles, Oklahoma State has a really good publication on blister beetles, and the cloverroot curculio, one of the better publications, is from the University of Idaho. But again, all these you can pull up on the web if you have need more information on these and what the insecticides are for management of some of these problems out in the field. So with that, hopefully we've covered most of the insects that you see in your field. If we have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
So if you have a question for Don, you can just unmute. Don, I'm not seeing anything in the chat quite yet, but this is a great time to ask some good insect questions.
Must have covered it. So.
We got a thank you there in the chat. So thank you, Don.
Okay.
One last chance for anybody got a question. Well, thank you, Don. I appreciate it. And Don was mentioning some KSU resources that are there. There's also the chemical weed control guide. Walt Fick, who's earlier presenter, is a contributor to that, and several others from K-State. Kind of gives you the different weeds and different kinds of insect controls all in one little booklet, anywhere from corn to alfalfa to rangeland. So you might check your extension office for that book as well. So
That is actually one of the better ones we've seen across the U.S. And we've actually printed some of those out, and it is one of the better ones out there.
well, with that, Don, again, thank you.